alien, non-native, introduced, exotic, and the synonyms for species that are moved intentionally or accidentally by humans to new regions. Biological invasion is that process, the process of moving these species from the original regions to other places. So how many introduced species become invasive? This is called the 10th rule by Williamson and Brown. And only 10% of all the species that we move establish in the new region. And only 10% of those become invasive. So only 1% of all the species that move around become invasive. And that means that have a negative impact on nature, economy, and our health. Impacts on nature. These invasive species are one of the 5 worst drivers of biodiversity loss. 37,000 alien species have been recorded, 200 new species every year. 3,500 invasive alien species have negative impacts on economy, nature, or health. From those, 1,000 are plants, 1,852 are invertebrates, 461 vertebrates, 141 are microbes. And when they say microbes, it's like everything from like mycorrhizae to any kind of microbe. They play a key role in the extinction of plants and animals. They know that they play a role in 60% of all the extinctions recorded. At least in 16% of those, they are the main drivers. There are 1,215 documented cases of local extinctions by non-native species, and 85% of all documented impacts of non-native species are negative. The most common impacts are changes in ecosystem, 27%, predation and herbivory, 18 and 12%, and competed with native species, 24%. So these are the impacts on nature. These are the economical costs of invasive species. 423 billions, last year in 2019, have been quadrupled since 1970. You can see the figure here, how we have increasing the cost of biological invasions. And here you have the different cost of some of the 100 worst or the 10 worst species. Health, also a huge impact of non-native species. We have the case of the Asian tiger mosquito. Globally, these mosquitoes have a significant global health problem because they estimate that around 700,000 to 1 million deaths because of the disease they carry. They transmit malaria, dengue, Zika, yellow fever, a lot of different diseases, and currently 40% of the population lives in places with mosquitoes. Not in all the places mosquitoes are non-native, but they are non-native in some of the places. But the talk today is not about all of these, that we know all of these already. We need to keep studying, but these are the direct impacts. I'm going to try to convince you today of 2 things. 1, we are underestimating the impacts of non-native species, and 2, to start collaboration with me about how we can look at different impacts of non-native species. So this is a representation of an ecosystem. You have native plants, arthropods, you have the green food web and the brown food web. Green, everything that eats like plants or anything above ground, brown, everything that is below ground. Then some non-native species is transported to this region. They establish and they become invasive. And you can see that they are displacing the native plants. So they are having a negative impact on the native plants. So those are the things that we record. Okay, these are the impacts on nature. These are the impacts on economy. So we know now we have less plants. But those plants do not live in isolation. I have many students here from our class. Community ecology, you know that everything interacts with everything in communities. So by replacing this non-native plant, you have cascading of extinctions in the rest of the ecosystem. So my lab for the last at least 15 years, we have been trying to understand these indirect effects. Are the effects mediated by a third species on another? A common example is you have this caterpillar being on the plant, so it's a negative effect on the plant. You have the bird eating on the caterpillar, it's a negative impact for the caterpillar. So it's a positive indirect impact on the plant by the bird by eating this caterpillar. So that's what we want to try to understand with invasive species. What are the indirect impacts? How much they are? How important they are? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of research I have been conducting in the lab on these indirect impacts. Aphenogaster rudis, keystone species, disperse around 74% of microcrus seeds on this region of the US. What they do is like they look for seeds that have this diosome, this is a repeat leach body. So they take the seed back to the nest, cut the diosome, they feed the larvae with the diosome, and then they discard the seeds in the trash pile, which is really rich in nutrients. This used to be Pachychondria chilensis, now it's Brachyponera chilensis, introduced in the US around 1932 from Japan, affects ant communities composition in the introduced range, and is found in undisturbed forests. Most of the ants are found in disturbed areas. This one is found in undisturbed forests. So we measure the number of ants in two sites. In white, you're gonna see invaded sites, invaded by the non-native, and in black, intact sites, sites that have been not invaded by these ants. You can see here that the invaded ant is only in the invaded plots, likely. And this one, who is a keystone species, reduced the abundance 96% in the invaded sites. So the keystone species has 96% less abundance in invasive sites. When we look at the number of seeds removed, there are 70% lower seeds removed in invasive plots. Remove it. That means that we put the seeds out on an index card, we set down for an hour, and we count how many seeds are taken away from different ant species. But this is not the same as seed dispersal, because these ants take a lot of seeds. But these ants don't eat the diosome, they eat the seed. So they are seed predators, not seed dispersers. So even they are removing some seeds, these are going to be consumed by the ants. The same with Formica subsericia and Campanatus pennsylvanicus. And also, because you reduce the number of seed dispersed, you have these indirect negative impacts on the population of the plants. We found 50% less plants in invaded sites than in intact sites. So we see these indirect effects on plant population just by disrupting the interaction with the native ant. Now let's go down to Patagonia. So let me here and talk about this keystone interaction that I've been working for almost 26 years now. It's between mistletoe. The cool thing about this mistletoe is that produce flowers in the middle of the winter. Similar winter like here. So you go to the forest, everything is covered by snow, and you see these beautiful red flowers. During winter, this mistletoe is the only resource of nectar for the hummingbird. So the hummingbird distribution overlaps the distribution of this mistletoe in winter, and they need the sugar to support the Patagonian winter. In summer, this hummingbird pollinates 20% of the woody flora and is the only pollinator for that 20%. In summer, the mistletoe produce green fruits when they are ripe, and they are only dispersed by this marsupial. The fruits have to pass, the seeds have to pass through the gut of the marsupial to have a chance of germination. And the cool thing is that this marsupial is more related with the Australian marsupial than with all South American marsupial, and is endemic to the forest. Back in the late 1900s, non-native ungulates deer were introduced from European people that want to have something to hunt in Patagonia. And they consume the host of the mistletoe, the most common host. Like there's one plant species that is 80% of all those plants have mistletoe, and it's the most common understory plant in those forests. Oh, this looks horrible. So this is the mistletoe. This is the host. Everything that goes from here to 0, this is negative. This is a negative impact. Overlap 0, no impact. Here is positive impact. So you can see that the number of hosts was reduced 60 times. There was less fruit removed from the host. 82 times less numbers of mistletoe on that sites. The hummingbird was the only one that was not affected because they can fly. After 2 years of trapping with Noelia, and it's a nocturnal marsupial, so having to go to at 3 a.m. to the forest, we couldn't catch any marsupial in the invaded sites. This is the most common bird. Sea disperser also was affected because the marsupial not only eat this plant, but also is the plants that produce fruit are 11 millimeters or bigger, the fruits. So it's the only sea disperser for many other plants. So that's also affect this bird, and also was a decrease in the number of fruiting plants on those sites. So by just eating the host of this mistletoe, this deer is producing all of these indirect cascades. Tino Vitali, who was a former PhD in the lab, studied the pollination and sea dispersal networks in those sites. So these are motif, these are the building blocks of the pollination and dispersal networks. And this is just one interaction, one plant, one animal, 2 plants, 1 animal, and becomes more complex. As it becomes more complex, the networks become more stable. So you can understand that if we lose this one, you lose completely the whole network. But here there are more redundancy in the interactions. So in blue, you will see sites that have these keystone interactions, and in yellow, invaded site. You can see that all the not invaded site, the site that we have the keystone interaction, are more complex on the network. So the networks on those sites are much more complex than the sites that have been invaded. Another example from Patagonia is Luciana Mota, who is an early researcher in the lab in Patagonia. She's studying wetlands in Patagonia, calling machines. So machines have been invaded by non-native ungulates. You see wild pigs here, you see cows in the back. This should look like this. So this machine wetland without non-native ungulates. This is with non-native ungulates. So she was looking at the impacts of these non-native ungulates on vegetation. Blue means control, no native ungulates. The different colors represent the abundance of the different non-native ungulates, horse, cows, and wild pig. You can see that as the number of ungulates abundance increase, the vegetation height decrease, and the vegetation cover also decrease. But this has also indirect effects. This is dragonfly larvae, worms, and flies larvae. You can see that as the non-native abundance increase, the dragonfly larvae decrease. Dragonfly larvae are top predators in this ecosystem. So you are losing a top predator, and you can see that these are the prey, they're increasing. So now we have 2 other students looking, okay, we know about this cross-ecosystem impact. What is gonna happen to the land again? Because these are gonna be more flies coming to the land, so maybe more spiders, maybe more pollinators, because these guys, the dragonfly adults, eat pollinators. Who knows what is gonna happen? But look at all the tree and cascading effects that you have just by these ungulates eating the vegetation in the ecosystem, in the terrestrial ecosystem. So how strong are these indirect impacts? So we are doing a meta-analysis, and when I say we, it means not me. This is Vegas, Rockefeller, undergrad in the lab, working with Eric. They are conducting this meta-analysis. In the first search, they found 1,945 papers. Only 521 are the ones that were selected for full text, and we have 149 that we are extracting data, and again, we use them. So last night, we have like a couple, I think we have only 15 papers that we have some data. So, you know, a meta-analysis is a mix of like apple and orange. It is like fruit salad. It's a mix of like things from the terrestrial ecosystem, because aquatic ecosystem, we have predators, we have everywhere, we have, it's a mess. But just to give you like a sneak peek of what is gonna happen. So I run an effect size, natural response ratio, presence of alien species, absence of alien species. So if we are looking at the impacts on plant abundance, if in the sites that are invaded, you have less plant, that means you have a negative effect. If the number of plants is equal, you have no effect. And if it are more, you have a positive effect of non-native species. So this is what I found yesterday at 11 p.m. These are not number of papers, these are number of studies. Some papers could have many species that are being studied. So again, this is, I think, only based on 15 papers out of the 150 that we have to read. There are two ways to read this. First, we can see that the direct impacts doubles the indirect impacts. Or we can read this that we are missing 50% of the indirect impacts. 50% of the indirect impacts are not being measured when we talk about the nature, the economy, and the health. So a short conclusion about this, and this is why I'm thinking there are some opportunities here to collaborate. We are doing this, there is some negative trend with nature. Yesterday, I begged to Brendan to give me like 5-minute talk in economy, and he explained me externalities and multiplier effects. We don't know what's gonna happen. I don't know, maybe there are some who are studying this and haven't read the papers yet, but it's gonna be really interesting if we can do something about the indirect impacts on economy. And I haven't read, and again, it could be papers out, about the indirect impacts on health. So there are like two things that we should like start like brainstorming, and I see the crowd here are really expert on this too. So we can help you with this part, and we can all work together trying to figure out the indirect impacts of non-native species in economy and health. But let's try to finish this talk with some like smiles in our faces, not like anything bad. So in our lab, we study the impacts of non-native species, but also trying to advance innovative science-based solutions to deal with non-native species. How many of you have been working as a volunteer controlling non-native species? Raise your hand. What is the most common thing that you do? Yes, you go and pull them and remove all of the non-native species. So you remove the non-native, and this is what happened later. You have tons of secondary non-native species invaded those sites. Those have been under control by competition by the dominant native species. When you release the competition, they take over. There is one principle in ecology that is like the arrival of a species is really important. If you have two species, one arrive before the other one, you have two different communities. So in this case, if this arrives before than this one, you have this community. If they arrive together, you have a different community. So the timing and the order of a species arrival is important for the end community. And that's called priority effect. And we have known this for the last almost 30 years. So if this is huge for community assembly, can we do the same thing for community disassembly? that's the order and timing of removal matters. So we call this inverse Pareto effects, and Noelia, Brendan, Taylor, we are all working together on trying to put an experiment with this. NSF has not liked it so far. So the idea is that we are gonna have these invaded communities, and we are gonna remove species in a different order and timing. And this is gonna be based on species interaction with the dominant species. When the dominant species have a huge impact on the communities, early in the spring, it's late in the summer. They produce fruits that need to be dispersed. They produce flowers that compete with the native flowers. The traits that they have, they produce allelochemicals. So we have to think about how we can tackle these and use inverse Pareto effects to manage these communities. And to give you a final and simple example, rabbits and cats are the most dangerous non-native species on islands. So there are two ways to do it. We can remove the cats first, and the rabbits are gonna take over, and they're gonna eat all the native vegetation. Or we can remove the rabbit first, but we need to remove the rabbit at the right time. Because if you remove the rabbit when it's the nesting season of birds, now the cats is gonna be hyper-predating those birds. But if it's not the nesting season, maybe we have the chance to remove the rabbit and then remove the cats. So this is an example of how we are thinking on applying this inverse priority effect. So the idea is that we are proposing this novel framework aiming to better understand how we can manage these non-native communities. And the idea is to use this base science that we know that is helping to build communities on how we can understand the restoration of these non-native communities. Without any signs on the 5 minutes, I'm done.